Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. This meeting is going to be recorded and posted to the OATS website and YouTube channel for the benefit of everyone who couldn't join us live. And this is the Organic Advisor Call Series. I'm your host, Nate Powell-Palm, and I'm the training specialist with OATS. The series is brought to you by the Organic Agronomy Training Service. This is our 15th episode. So please visit the OATS website to view the call schedule of our future call topics, as well as our previous calls. And if you haven't done so already, I highly recommend signing up for the newly launched Organic Advisor listserv, where we have some great conversations right in your inbox and all things related to advising organic farmers. And we will drop the link to sign up in the chat. So that is pretty much it for housekeeping. I'm so excited to welcome our guest, Dr. Julie Kunen, today. Dr. Kunen is the Director of Sustainability for Oatly North America, and she's responsible for leading execution of the company's global sustainability priorities in the region and spearheading new sustainability initiatives. So welcome, Dr. Kunen. I will remind everyone that if you have any questions for Dr. Kunen, drop them in the chat. And if we have time, we'll try to incorporate them into the conversation. Julie, thank you so much for being with us today. Really glad to have you. You have a long and really interesting career. And I was wondering if you could tell us how you got to the oats space. And now we're going to have trouble because we are the Organic Agronomy Training Service, but we're actually just talking about the oats crop today. So every time I say oats,
yeah, I mean, this could be a very long story or a very short story. So I will give you the brief version and then happy to say more about anything else that people are interested in. But I started out training to be an anthropologist. So I've always really been interested in the relationship between people and place, right? So people and the environment that they're in, cultures and societies, and the landscapes and the ecosystems that they exist in, and that like dynamic and that interrelationship. I don't know why that's my thing, but I find that fascinating. And so I studied anthropology and for a while entertained ideas of being a professor. I was briefly a professor. But I got into the field of international development and conservation. And, you know, so much of that field is about agriculture because it is, of course, about how people largely in the developing world are making a living, and large, proportions of those populations are farmers. So I kind of slowly over the years just got into agriculture, agroforestry, mostly in the tropical regions of the world. I spent most of my career actually in Latin America. And, you reach a certain age maybe, or a certain stage in your career, and you think, we have these issues in our own country too. Like, I should maybe come home and sort of try to be part of the community of solutions for like our own communities and our own backyard and our own country. And so I made a very deliberate decision to take a domestic position and wanted to really, just like to work for a place that was trying to solve problems. And I thought, working in the sustainable food space and focusing that in North America would be a great next thing to do. So.
Well, and that really just dives right into a lot of the questions I have for you today. But I will remind everyone who just joined us, go ahead and drop any questions you have into the chat box, and we'll try to incorporate them into the conversation today. Just the most basic question for Oatly in general. Why oats, other than it makes a great name? Of all the seeds and grains, what is that winning nutritional or agronomic factor that made oats so appealing?
Yeah, so for folks who don't know, Oatly, although we kind of burst onto the scene in North America in around 2016 and sort of seem, I think, like maybe a sort of a crazy startup brand, the company is actually about 35 years old. And it was founded in Sweden by a pair of professors at the University of Lund in southern Sweden, who were looking at nutritional alternatives for the large numbers of population in the world, and also especially in Scandinavia, who are lactose intolerant. And so the researchers were looking for a crop that would be allergen-free on a variety of levels and provide a good balance of carbohydrates and particularly fiber, which is obviously one of the things that oats is known for. And so, and could be sort of the premise of the company is, can we make dairy alternatives that taste just as good as dairy, that function just as well as dairy, that can be used by people in their livelihoods, or in their daily lives, excuse me, for dairy, but don't have the allergen problems that lots of folks experience, and that, can offer a good nutritional component. And they tested a bunch of stuff and they landed on oats. So like 35 years ago, they started this crazy oat company. And then, it's obviously evolved into what it is today.
And for everyone, Julie is not an oats buyer, so we won't be able to help you with the questions of how does Oatly buy my oats. But at a high level, when Oatly was building the supply chain, your job, from my understanding, is looking at how do we, as you said in your intro, affect change via the supply chain and trying to figure out how we put more opportunities. A recent piece that I just dropped a link into the chat for everybody was in Civil Eats, and it's talking about this question of why do we have so few oat acres, and it actually features Julie and Oatly writ large about the explosion of oat milk and the possible opportunity for farmers. So when thinking about that supply chain, Julie, what is it that really excites you about the agronomic potential for oats that you've seen both in North America, but also sort of that global footprint back in Europe?
Yeah, I mean, I think one place to start is just the commitment that the company has to try to source the oats as locally, by which I mean region, as possible. So we have a large European market for the company. We have a growing Asia Pacific market for the company, and we have the North American market for the company. And each of those three regions sources their oats in different places. So one of the places that we start is to say, can we buy the oats from the continent that we're on, which perhaps to this group of people seems like an obvious thing, but like in the world of global traded commodities is not an obvious thing. So we do in North America source all of our oats from North America. And that, is not by accident. And right now, like most of the oats for most oat purchasing companies come from Canada. I think probably people on this call might know that Canada is the largest exporter of oats in the world. And they grow a tremendous volume of them at on a tremendously large scale. But the question about oats in the United States is a question, of the industrialization of the agricultural system, right? I mean, oats used to be a crop that, a couple generations ago, people routinely worked into the rotations on their farm. And as crops got bigger and or farms got bigger, and the sort of whole, get bigger, get out kind of philosophy, along with, lots of things that we could dive into, insurance, subsidies, agrochemicals, et cetera, we have ended up in a system where the large majority of farmers in the areas that used to grow oats now grow corn and soybeans. And so now it is a question of bringing oats back into the rotation. And then separately, and maybe Nate, you'll want to unpack this, we can talk about, oats for livestock versus oats for people, and, why sort of it's hard maybe to find the oats for people.
That I do. So I'd like to unpack everything you just said, but let's start on that question about quality and specs. An oat that goes into Oatly or an oat that goes into feed is going to just be a different creature, right? And so what is that difference, and how does the landscape look as far as what we grow currently and what we need to grow to meet that demand?
So as I'm about to answer this question, I see that one of the people who's joined the call is Eric DeBleek, who I work with really closely, who probably has a much better way of answering this question than I do. So Eric, you're going to correct me if I get something wrong. I mean, I will premise by saying I am not an agronomist. So I'm going to give a general answer that is appropriate maybe to someone in my position at the company, which is to focus on the sustainability of the crop and the farming systems that we source from. I am not the procurement manager, and I'm not, as I said, an agronomist, so I may not get all of this right. But I know that there's a difference in test weight between feed grade crop and food grade oats. And we, and food grade tends to be a higher test weight. And I know that that is a challenge sometimes to achieve in the growing conditions that exist in some of the warmer or wetter parts of the region. But my understanding is that it is not like a distinct different variety. Like I think it's maybe the same set of varieties, but I also know that there has not been a lot of maybe variety research That's ticking up now as people are sort of turning a bit more to small grains research. But, the research that has been invested into crops like corn and soy has not existed at large scale for crops like oats. And so we're just a little bit behind in terms of really refining that and tailoring the different varieties to the different growing regions in the United States.
My understanding is Canada has an entire oats board that is really sort of an industry equivalent to research and advocacy and promotion that it does not exist in the United States. So partly, hopefully, with this new excitement will allow folks to feel the permission, both in academia as well as industry, to put more of that into it. Go ahead.
Can I just say one more thing about that? Because I mentioned that I started my career in sort of the tropical arena for agriculture. I mean, there is a global network of agricultural research centers that's known as the CGIAR. It's the, something International Agriculture Research Network, and it invests enormous amounts of time and money into the major crops of the world, like wheat, maize, potatoes, rice. They all have their own institutes. It doesn't have its own institute.
Yeah.
Even on the global scale, it sort of hasn't gotten the same kind of attention.
Eric, if you want to unmute at any point and jump in here, please do feel free. Realize we're catching you possibly when you're not ready to go on camera, but if you'd like, you are more than welcome to. Jumping back to this. Oh, are you?
No, I was just going to say, Julie kind of got the premise of the answer to that one. Difference between feed and food grade, test weight, physical quality, thins, those kind of things. And then there's also a little bit of nutritional quality differences that sometimes come up just in like hull out or the difference between groat and hull percentage, and then sometimes things like oil or fat content within oats. So there are some older lines that have higher oil content that really just don't fit the nutritional side of the oat world some days. But other than that, Julie had it. So
Thank you, Eric. Super helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
As a follow-up to that real quick, Eric, is there something about growing in the continental US versus Canada agronomically and weather-wise that leads US oats versus Canadian oats to experience more thins or more reasons that they end up not making food grade versus feed?
Yeah, so a lot of that is really probably primarily climate, cooler nights and cooler days in Canada. When we look at the growing season as a whole, that's usually what it seems to be, is a little bit of a cooler night and a cooler day scenario, especially when that oat plant is in the middle of pollination or flowering and fill, is when that becomes really, really important to not get really hot days and get some nights that are relatively cool. Here in the US, that seems to happen, sometime mid to late June, and we always seem to catch some hot spells that really kind of, hurts US growers, where, in Canada, they still, even during their hot spells, usually get, down into cooler nights where it's, in the 50s and 60s. So, which really helps versus those warm 70 and humid nights that we'll see sometimes in summer.
Awesome. That's really helpful. In thinking about the going back to, as you were saying, the industrialization, where there was a big push to get corn and beans through a series of incentives and market conditions. What could you describe some of those factors that you've seen both in your research and in the farms that you work with today?
Yeah, you're asking me, right?
Yes, sorry, Julie. Yep. Thank you, Eric.
Eric will probably do this. Yeah, so I mean, a couple of things. You mentioned that you dropped the link into the chat of the article that just came out in Civil Eats. So while Oatly sources the bulk of its oats, and just sidebar to say that we source them in the form of groats, so not raw oats off the field, we do source them as groats. We do source the majority today from Canada. We have invested for the last 5 years in trying to figure out what we as a company, what could we do to help support the return of oats to rotations on farms in the Midwest, and what, quite frankly, would be the role of an oat buying company in that farming system. So for the last 5 years, we have partnered with Practical Farmers of Iowa, which some of you might be familiar with, a fantastic farmer-led nonprofit based in, obviously, Iowa. And the Sustainable Food Lab, another really fantastic NGO that is interested in, ensuring the sustainability of our future farm system. We've partnered with them and with Grain Millers, our mill partner, which is how Eric and I know each other, to just sort of basically see, can we tweak that ecosystem? And by which I mean not the natural ecosystem, but just like the farm ecosystem, in a way that would incentivize farmers to reintroduce oats and cover crops back into their rotations for all of the benefits that we know that would bring. Obviously, more agrobiodiversity on the farm, breaking up of pest cycles, changing up the nutrient requirements and the water requirements, diversifying the economic portfolio of the farmers, all of the things that we know that would do. And with the also proposition with the cover crop that hopefully over the long term, we can start to see a decline in the need for synthetic nitrogen, which again would be better economically for farmers if they don't have to buy those inputs, and would have knock-on effects in terms of ecosystem health. So that's the work that we've been doing. And I will say we have a really dedicated cadre of farmers in Iowa and southern Minnesota who have figured out how to do this successfully. They have grown food grade oats that we have bought that have been processed by grain millers. So it does work. It can be done for sure. I think that's important to say. There are challenges in that system that have a lot more to do with things like infrastructure availability, processing availability, machinery, right? I mean, we're talking about a whole different, small grain farming is a different thing, requires different machinery. There aren't a lot of silos around that can handle it. There aren't a lot of local processors. So we've seen things like that. Again, that's like, I just dumped a huge amount of information on the table to unpack that. But at a system level, that is what we've seen. It is doable and there are challenges.
When you have worked with these farmers over the last few years, have they come to you saying like, this is a real barrier for us, though we overcame it, like this is what's held us up or made us reconsider going this route, adding this third crop?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would, yes. And obviously, with the help of the technical support that PFI can offer and the help of the agronomy support that Eric and his colleagues can offer. I think there's really been two domains in that, two general buckets of things that happen. One is, practices on farm. And so, we kind of try to crack that nut in the way probably everyone on this call would crack that nut. We do farm days, right? And we get together and we, some of the farmers who have been trying oats for a longer period of time are sharing their lessons with, the farmers that are just starting out. And we get together. Last summer, we did a really fantastic farmer field visit in Iowa and Minnesota, and we all got together over lunch. And, people talked like, what variety worked for you? I tried this. What's the mix of cover crops? When did you get the crop in? So we talk about all those things that everybody on this call, like I said, probably talk about. And I think having a community of experienced oat growers, like it sounds like the most obvious thing, but that is probably like the number one thing that is needed is folks who have tried it, folks who have figured stuff out, folks who have maybe failed but been supported to fail, because that's one of the things that Oatly does, is that we support the de-risking of this practice adoption, to say it in the most jargony way in the world. We pay people to try stuff, and if it doesn't work, we still pay them.
Yeah. I love that. And I think that speaks to there's lots of times threads that connect these conversations on the Organic Agronomy call series. And one of those is, how do you get advisors? And I think we oftentimes think of advisors as more formal fee-for-service or company advisors that help farmers overcome barriers. But I think that there's nothing more compelling than your neighbor saying, this worked. I promise you won't go belly up. In our region, given our soils, how we work here. Did you find that there was any sort of critical mass of you need 2 farmers in the neighborhood to have folks start to create a snowball effect, or it just takes one? Any findings there?
Yeah, that is a great question. And let me reflect. I mean, we've done this type of approach in the US, and we also did it in Canada and did a big farm tour of folks who were adopting more advanced regenerative processes in Canada. And so I'm just like thinking in my head, I mean, my honest answer is that I think it might just take one sometimes. So maybe I'll say 2 things, Nate, in response to your question. One is, it is definitely important to have a community of practice in the sense of people willing to try things. So not in the sense of there having to be multiple people who have succeeded or multiple people who are expert. But we hear repeatedly every time we visit farm communities that one of the biggest barriers is just not feeling like the weirdo outlier who got ostracized at church, right? Or like in the supermarket. And your neighbor comes up to you and like complains that your fields look dirty, or that you're growing some weird shit on your, weird stuff on your field, or that, you're just not doing it the way everybody does it in your community. Those people have to be, brave enough, quite frankly, to sort of be the outliers. And I recall last summer when we were up in Canada, we were meeting with this fantastic couple who have a very successful regenerative farm. And they talked about the fact that like for years, they stopped getting invited to people's Christmas parties because they were not socially acceptable. So it's possible that it's the anthropologist in me that's emphasizing this point a lot, but just to say, having a community of people who are trying it together is definitely critical. But in terms of the expertise, what I have seen in both geographies is that it really just takes one. And I saw, particularly this summer last summer when we were out in Iowa, like there's one guy who has just been doing it longer, who has a lot of and people just gravitated to him, and he formed a little node, and then people try things and then they report back. And so I think it's both things. But I think you're absolutely right that finding that technical, that's what you all are here to do, right? We need so much more of the kind of technical assistance that's going to look at regenerative and holistic farm practices and move away from kind of the industrial extension advice that everybody's used to getting and used to receiving when they train up at the land-grant universities.
I'm curious about when you say the folks who didn't get invited to Christmas parties for a few years, was there something in particular about their farming practices or about their fields, weeds, or something agronomic that was like the social last straw where you're just like, no invitation going out to you?
Look, I have a sample size of 2, so I'm not going to say this is.
We say it's anecdotal, but that's all right.
I would say in the US, more frequently, what I hear is that people say that the critique is that their fields look weedy or dirty, right? Because they're like a little bit messier. In Canada, it seemed to be, and folks on this call probably know that, a lot of times in Canada, it's not uncommon in regenerative field systems to have, 6 or 7 crops in rotation. So in Canada, the critique was more like, what is that weird crop that you're growing? I never heard of that thing before, whatever it was, flax or, whatever it was. So 2 different answers in 2 different places, but I'm not going to say definitively that those are the
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. As you look to the infrastructure that's around oats, it's something that we've talked about several times before, but the ease of offtake seems like such a barrier, just organic writ large, anything that's somewhat identity preserved, that we don't have the opportunity to go to our local elevator and just like generations before, drop our grain at harvest and make it easy. We have to keep it for months and months and have special trucks come and pick it up. What could you just ideate for a minute on how you see us sort of addressing that barrier? What do you see as some practical solutions?
Yeah, I will ideate on that. And I will also say that for a company like Oatly, we have the additional barrier of the fact that our products are certified gluten-free. And so obviously, while oats inherently is a gluten-free crop, we get into the same problem of having to segregate and preserve it or somehow clean it, depending on the system, because we need it not to get mixed in with the rest of the grain that people are growing, or, if it's transported in the same truck or stored in the same silo, processed at the same mill, there has to be, protocols to sort of separate that, so that we have made for ourselves and important, of course, because as I said, the origin of the company is to provide allergen-free alternatives for people, and obviously gluten is a thing that people are concerned about a lot. So yeah, I mean, again, Eric will probably have thoughts on this topic also, but you've exactly hit it. The storage limitations and how do I want to say this? And I might use the wrong language again because
all good.
Perspective. But yeah, I mean, there have to be sort of community accessible like aggregator silos where people can bring it off of their farm and sort of, load up. And then the lack of milling is a complete barrier. Like there are very few mills, Grain Millers has one of them in Minnesota. There are very, very few mills in the Midwest that are still processing oats. And it is a very long distance for people to go. They have to have their own trucks. And the other thing then I would say, again, this might be specific for Oatly, but as part of our sustainability commitment, we receive our oats by rail car, our processed oats, so our oats from the mill by rail car to our factories. And so the mills themselves then need to have rail accessibility to be able to offload the oats and ship them to us. And that's, very few do. So those are the things that I have seen.
That's amazing. And I don't use that word lightly. I think that rail is one of those serious linchpins in how do we more cost effectively move organic foods around the country, identity preserved foods, these foods that bring more value to farms are oftentimes, at least in my experience, both selling and working with other farmers, folks feel much more comfortable with trucks. It's an easier unit to control. You can control it versus keeping it on a rail and having to have different cleanup procedures. Was it very hard to get a system that allowed you to feel confident in the gluten-free protection integrity of a rail inbound system for your groats?
Yeah, there's a lot of cleaning that goes on.
Okay.
I mean, I don't think so. Yes, I mean, obviously, I don't want to be facetious about it. It's obviously a serious consideration, and we take the quality standard and, of course, the certification very, very seriously. We work with mills that either completely segregate on a physical basis or use a purity protocol to clean the oats to standards. But the issue of then ensuring that the rail cars themselves have also been cleaned properly, is a step that we would require our partners to take, which is obviously another, yet another thing that has to get done. And so that's, yeah, that is what happens.
Pretty cool. I think I've heard of a lot of companies being approached to receive by rail because it's a lot cheaper for that transportation factor from farm to buyer, and that concern has often been that they just don't feel like they can get it clean enough. So props to Oatly for making that leap.
I mean, maybe I would say one more thing about that, because I think what you're pointing at really is then like the scale challenge, of course, right? Because these kind of investments are made, in order to make that investment, both in, building a mill that can handle that capability, or having the resources to be able to clean. And again, this is Oatly and it's gluten-free standard. Not everybody perhaps requires that. But it's harder than to think about, small scale community mills. Like we'd love to be able to think about something that looks like this movement that's going on in the country right now for like small scale local community slaughterhouses, right? Like where it's embedded in the community and you don't have to go to the big aggregators. And it's doable, but these are some of the considerations, right? If you're
absolutely. Yeah. Could you speak a little bit more to that? And we can possibly pull Eric in for the logistics side. But what are those barriers? Is it purely just the number of pounds of oats that need to be leaving the mill at a certain rate? Is it the quality? What is the barrier to currently not use smaller mills, or have, if someone wanted to build a small mill, be an option to be a supplier? And I don't mean to say that I assume that at all, but just sort of as a theoretical.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think from the mill construction side, I mean, I actually am aware of at least one effort in the Midwest right now to seek investment to build a smaller scale mill that, you know, would be able to process oats and, you know, potentially other small grain. So I think, you know, the basic barrier is just investment in that, right? That's hard. Independent, you know, mill operations are a little bit hard. Our friends in Canada, some of the more successful models that I've seen there have led to vertical integration on farm, which is a really big capital investment, right? We visited, I was up in Saskatchewan and Manitoba last summer, and we visited 2 farms that had gone the distance to basically vertically integrate on their own farm. They had their own milling, they didn't have rail to the farm, I will say that, but they had their own milling capabilities on farm. That's like a huge capital commitment. And it's also, you need technical expertise to know how to do that, right? Like milling is a separate profession from farming.
Yes.
I have come to understand. So I think there's that. And then, you know, maybe this is a good place also to sort of do the honest reality check. And again, what I'm about to say, I say with the proviso that I am not in charge of procurement at Oatly. I am not the one that makes the buying decisions, but we are a relatively small company. And, you know, there has to be a compelling reason for the company to develop 10 sourcing relationships as opposed to 2 sourcing relationships. You know, I mean, from our perspective, of course, you need to hedge your risk a little bit, but you know, it adds orders of magnitude of complexity to the puzzle if you have to, you know, move around small volumes from lots of different places to aggregate into a product. So from the buying perspective, that's not necessarily beneficial. From my perspective of can we support farmers, you know, across the region to invest in and feel supported to move to regenerative oat farming practices, of course I want to see that. Then it's a conversation and we figure out like where is the middle. But I just, you know, the logistical and purchasing complexity of doing lots of small buys from small operators, you know, is not insignificant. And I do think it's important to just acknowledge that.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, I couldn't echo that enough. And I think that's something we've had several folks who are in co-ops for farmers and figuring out how do you aggregate and organize effectively as farmers so that you aren't presenting the proposition that farmers, or rather buyers, should work with 100 different farmers directly, because that's just probably a non-starter for a lot of companies needing to be able to operate efficiently.
Can I add, would you mind if I added one more comment?
Sure, please.
I think this is often where I get into conversations with folks and realize that I haven't necessarily made our value proposition clear, is that, you know, Oatly itself does not have a direct sourcing relationship directly with farmers.
Right.
And that a lot of times that's what people desire. And I can definitely see the benefit of that. But because, as I mentioned earlier, we buy a processed oat, right? I mean, a minimally processed oat, we buy groats. You know, our relationship is with our milling partner. And it's not as easy for us to think about, you know, can we just do a direct sourcing with farmers arrangement? And that is why I would say the trilateral relationship between the company, the producers, and the mill is absolutely essential. And I cannot stress enough good relationships with the mill partner who can provide often agronomic support. Obviously, Eric is one of the people who does that. But that's, you know, we have always gone into this as it's a 3-part relationship and it has to work for all 3 parts, you know, as opposed to just saying, because I get farmers write to us all the time to say, I'm growing these oats, can you buy them? And I would love to be able to say yes, but that's not the model that our company is built on. It's definitely a model other companies are built on, but just to be very transparent about that so people understand the perspective that I'm coming from.
Absolutely. Thank you for that clarification too. As we think about where the oats are grown in relationship to this logistics question of Oatly has plants, Eric at Grain Millers has mills, and then we have weather. Where is that spot that you see oats becoming more of a common crop? Is it the central Midwest, upper Midwest? How do we balance all those sort of 3 factors? You said that trilateral relationship, and consider the climate, the geography.
That is such a great question. And just yesterday, I requested a proposal from a company that is out there that I will not name, that does sort of climate risk projections and analysis for growing regions around the world. But in this particular case, we're going to be looking at the US and Canada. And I just asked them to do an analysis for us, both of the climate risks that may exist in the current growing regions for us. So that would be the Canadian prairies and, as I said, the sort of northern Iowa, southern Minnesota region. But I'm also asking them to look at places like the Dakotas, or eastern Montana, where you and I both live in Montana. I think we're going to be, I have seen good oats coming out of the Palouse region in Idaho, and eastern Washington and Oregon. I know that there are also, there's a oat growing sort of node in Colorado. So those are the areas that I look at. I mean, I can't say definitively this one is, better. I would never, first of all, I would never say that, because so much has to do with just the way people farm and their practices and their skills, and obviously what they do on their farms. But those are the general regions that we look at, and those are the general areas that we're thinking about. And then just thinking about, what do we need to be prepared for, obviously, as climate change increases. Obviously, we've had a couple of years with some really significant wildfires that have affected crop, and we have to be prepared for that.
In backing up just a little bit to our very first question about sort of the value proposition of oats, from your research and your experience in the sustainability of oats, how do you feel oats scores in the long run as a crop that's going to be resilient to a changing climate and the challenges so many farmers face across the country?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty enthusiastic about oats for a very, very basic reason, which is that they don't always need to be irrigated, and most of the time they're not irrigated. So, if you're looking at a water scarce climate, I mean, obviously people can read the newspaper and they can see what's going on, for example, in the Colorado River system, and this crazy year of snow notwithstanding, obviously we've had years of drought and subnormal rainfall in the western part of the United States. So a crop that doesn't need to be irrigated, high on my list of resiliency, requiring many fewer chemical inputs than many other crops in a world where we're trying to wean ourselves off of fossil fuel. I mean, for all of those reasons, I'm very optimistic about the role of oats in a sort of more climate stressed planet.
Absolutely. Yeah. We actually have one question from the audience, and maybe for Eric. Hannah was asking, in line with infrastructure, has Oatly been assessing where the flexibility may be with specs like test weight that would still make quality product, but perhaps be easier for farmers to make? And this is a question close to my heart, Hannah, because as I've discovered over the years, there is a range. So would you be able to speak to that at all, Julie, or possibly Eric?
One thing about it in a general sense, but then if Eric feels comfortable speaking, I would love to hear what he has to say. Hannah, I don't know specifically the answer to your question, although what I would say is Oatly does have a science and technology division and a research lab. It is based in Sweden, and I know that they are doing ongoing research both on varieties and things like, can we grow, for example, a higher protein oat or a higher fiber oat? But I think they're also looking at things like, can we make the product that we need to make out of oats that come up with different specs, right? So if you can imagine it right now, the way we make this obviously is, oat milk is an emulsification basically of oats, oil, and water. And it has a certain amount of protein in it, a certain amount of fiber in it, a certain amount of solids of other kinds in it. And so they're in charge of sort of doing a bunch of research about how much flexibility is there in the raw material so that we can get to a product that's standardized and sort of meets our nutritional and sort of functional food science needs. So that's what I would say there, but Eric may be able to speak specifically to a test weight question, which I cannot in any more detail. But he also doesn't have to if he doesn't want to.
I'll try and make it quick. I don't want to steal the show this morning. So the simple answer to that is we have seen some pretty good luck with growers over the years, cleaning up lower test weight oats to get something that's a little bit higher to kind of meet that range that we need to see for food grade. There's obviously always a limit to that of what can be cleaned up and what can be, run through whether it's gravity tables or quick cleans or all sorts of different equipment that we've seen growers use to pull out some percentage of thins or some percentage of the lighter oats to really kind of help improve that test weight. So the simple answer to that question is, yeah, we've seen it and we've seen some pretty good luck. But as with all things, there's just such a limit of what can and can't be done. So you got to kind of be close to that minimum threshold, which for us as a milling industry, and especially on the organic side, is right around that 36-pound oat mark. What we usually find better luck with is working with growers on fertility and rotation and seeding rates and all the agronomic conditions to really put them in a great place to try and make test weight long before we see better luck of trying to clean things to improve it to hit quality that it needs to. So
if I could ask one follow-up to that, Eric, as we look to infrastructure, there's $70 million about to go out from the USDA for organic market development. And a big question is infrastructure. What can we do to augment that supply chain? Are there certain cleaners that you do see, if we had more of them out and about, we'd be seeing more farmers make test weight, be it a quick clean or other? Would you have any ones that you would say farmers have had better luck with in cleaning their oats for spec?
I see two things that growers use quite often just to give themselves bumps and test weights, and that's things like a quick clean or a rotary cleaner. I know Quick Clean, I think, is a brand, but there's a whole variety of different brands out there that do simple cleans that seem to work pretty well when you're looking at things like weed seed or thins or those kind of material. We also see really good luck with grain vacs, which is not always well known, but growers who usually run their oats through a grain vac, when they're loading trucks or whatever, we can see them pick up about a pound in test weight.
Wow.
Just by running it through a grain vac.
And just pure curiosity, any reason why?
There's a lot to, we have this conversation a lot, even internally, of what it actually is that causes it. Some of it, we think it just kind of roughs it up enough and breaks off some of those awns or debeards it essentially just a little bit, and just allows it to kind of pack in a little bit better into a volumetric space. And then obviously a grain vac does a good job of help kicking out some really fine chaffy material and dust and those kind of things. So
Totally.
It's been foolproof essentially for quite a few years for us. If growers are real close, that's what we recommend.
Super. Yeah, thank you for that. We have another question, Julie, and I think this is a very interesting one. So seeing the more recent entry of more brands into the oat milk market, what do you see as the growth potential of the whole market in general? And is it a displacement for almond and soy or a transition from dairy? And I know this is your wheelhouse, so please go right ahead.
Love this question. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate you asking it. I would say overall, the oat milk market continues to grow. I mean, you're absolutely right that there are more brands in the space. And while, of course, in one sense, that is competition for my company, in another sense, as a purpose-driven company whose stated mission is to encourage plant-based eating and to enable people to make plant-based choices as part of their contribution to the solution to the climate crisis and the other planetary environmental crises we're in. We're glad to see that. We have, and I know that sounds maybe a little, funky, but we have always seen that the growth of plant-based overall is a win, because it's a win for the planet. And it's also a win for companies being able to demonstrate that they can actually succeed and make money in this business. And we all know that big dairy is really big, right? And when we talk about dairy, I think this is also important to say, when we talk about replacing dairy, the primary thing that we have in mind is sort of huge industrial dairy with all of the problems that brings, from an animal cruelty side to a manure management side, to confinement side, to what they're feeding those animals. So we don't talk about sort of, small, very, very small scale family dairy or sort of rotationally grazed. Well, you don't really do that with dairy cows, but anyway. So I would say the oat milk market overall continues to grow, and the market data that I've seen recently definitely show that. our analysis shows that it is still, for us, a question of a transition from people using cow milk dairy. So that's sort of the alternative that we set ourselves up against. Soy products have really kind of declined over the years, and at least the market data that I've seen recently show that market is shrinking. Almond is still, I would say, the next popular plant option, and we've just started talking about whether or not we need to have more conversations about the sort of water use issues that would distinguish oat milk from almond milk. In general, we have tried not to denigrate or critique, as I said, other plant-based options, because in general, they are all substantially better from an environmental perspective, and particularly a greenhouse gas perspective, than cow dairy. However, given the intensity of the water use in most almond farming, we're starting to talk about whether or not we need to make that distinction for folks so that they can make the choice that they want to be able to make. So I hope that answered your question and that it didn't sound like too much market speak. If it did, I'm happy to rephrase that in some way.
Michael, do you want to unmic if you have any follow-up to that? I think this is a very interesting point of the conversation.
No, I don't. I think I thank you for that answer, because I just was kind of curious, because Oatly was kind of like a fad thing that came vis-a-vis basically the coastal coffee market, so to speak, and it was a discovery, and now it's kind of evolved in the grocery store space. And then all of a sudden now you go into the store and there are 4 different brands in the oat shelf. And so it's really remarkable, this transition that's happened in a really relatively short time. But and I absolutely agree with you. I mean, the almond, while not attacking almonds specifically, but because it is a good product, so to speak, but its water use profile is just horrible. And I think it's all fair game to really talk honestly about that without being negative about it. I think it's a conversation that needs to have as to, relatively speaking, how many gallons does it take to grow oats versus grow almonds. And I said more conversely, us as organic farmers, is I think that the oat market is more of a positive for farmers on a broad plane than the almond market, because it's very concentrated in 1 or 2 tiny areas in California, versus you're talking about distributing a potential growing opportunity throughout the United States, or at least the northern United States. And I think that's a conversation that I mean, you're really, especially as in your field, about talking about how do we raise this boat with all small and regenerative farmers.
I think, Michael, I mean, I think you've raised some really great questions, and I particularly love this last point that you just made about oats being much more broadly distributed, and as opposed to 1 or 2 tiny pockets of growing in California. I think you're absolutely right about that. I maybe could also say, so just this past year, Oatly commissioned what's something called a comparative life cycle assessment, or an LCA, if any of you have ever heard of that. It is a peer-reviewed study that looks from cradle to grave, basically. So from the inputs that go into the farm to the appearance of the product on the shelf, and then the way in which the package at the end of life is disposed of. And we compared across 6 of our markets, including the United States, our sort of flagship product, which, as you have rightly noted, was sort of it's the gray barista bottle of Oatly, or carton of Oatly, which, as you quite rightly said, kind of came in through the coasts and the coffee shops and things. We analyzed that compared to national dairy data in each of those countries. And our product is, I think it's 46% fewer greenhouse gas emissions associated with the product, and 71% less water use in the system. So that is like a substantial win for oats against dairy. And as I said, I think it would be interesting to then look at the water comparison against almond. We have not done that yet, but we are thinking about doing that.
Thank you, Michael. Really great questions. And if anybody else has questions, we still have a few minutes left, so please drop them in the chat. In thinking about that question of distribution, is there, as you look to consider the regenerative supply chain, and as it relates to the locations of the Oatly mill, or sorry, the Oatly production facilities, is there any consideration from on the Oatly side for trying to shorten those miles as you look to 10 years out, the future plans? Do you see building more in kind of oat country in the US, or is it too long a supply chain to really think about that, the two actors instead of the trilateral?
Yeah, it's not that it's too long of a supply chain to think about. It's that when we look at the impact of the ingredient part of our supply chain on particularly our carbon footprint, the transportation piece of it is not that significant. By far the most important piece of the footprint. So I should say, and for folks who are interested, and if I can figure out how to do this, I'll maybe put the link into the chat. So Oatly just published its sustainability report for 2022. And in that, of course, we look at our corporate footprint and we look at our footprint across the different markets, including North America. Ingredients is the largest piece of Oatly's footprint. It's globally 42% of our footprint comes from our ingredients. That is not surprising, given that we are basically a company that depends on agricultural products to make what we sell. But within the ingredients, by far the most significant piece of the impact is the on-farm piece. And so honestly, the transport of the raw material is relatively minor. We're pretty happy with a rail link. For folks who don't know, we have oat base. We have factories in southern New Jersey, which is maybe a funny spot to have it, and in Utah. And it's to have some rail cars come down from Saskatchewan to Utah is not a huge deal usually. So no, I would say we're not really looking at that because that's not a really significant piece of the impact. We are definitely focusing on the on-farm practices.
Fascinating. Are there any in particular on-farm practices that you see as being the best bang for buck as far as addressing, reducing, changing to speed along this effort to reduce that overall environmental impact?
Yeah, I mean, that is possibly a whole other conversation, but we're summarizing for this group that Oatly has over the last 2 years designed a major investment in regenerative farming. It is called, in quirky Oatly style, FARM, which stands for Future Agriculture Renovation Movement. We have set as a company a goal of sourcing 100% of our strategic materials sustainably by 2029. Obviously, oats is the most critical of our strategic material, followed by canola, non-GMO canola, which is the other crop that we rely upon for our product. So we, and I've been leading this work, have defined basically a whole outcome-based approach. I think that's important to specify, is that we're focused on outcomes around greenhouse gas reductions, increased biodiversity, increased ecosystem health, and importantly, farm viability and resilience. Those are the buckets that we are looking to see outcomes around. We are trying very, very hard not to prescribe specific practices. There are basic practices that will be surprised to no one on this call. Minimizing till and cover cropping. That's, as a entry level regenerative sort of area. But we basically have a program set up where we're trying to incentivize farmers to deliver those outcomes by doing whatever on their farms that they need to do to get that done, because I'm not the farmer and I can't tell you specifically what needs to happen. So that's the broad outlines, and anyone who wants to know more about that, I'm happy to talk more about that. But the other thing I would say in answer to your question is so many people in the regenerative space talk about soil carbon. Obviously, that's critical. I'm not going to say it's not. But we are seeing that there's huge opportunities in reducing synthetic nitrogen loads. Nitrous oxide is a major greenhouse gas. The overapplication of synthetic nitrogen is significantly contributing to the climate crisis. It is also obviously the leading culprit in affecting water quality and contributing to hypoxic zones in the Gulf of Mexico and other discharge areas. And the embodied fossil fuel content of synthetic nitrogen is enormous, right? The fossil fuels that go into producing the darn thing. So we are focusing really, really heavily on can we find practices that will enable farmers to reduce the loads of nitrogen that they put on subsequent crops in the rotation and bring down that whole load? So soil carbon, yes. Nitrogen, let's all think about nitrogen.
Thank and amen. Oh my gosh, yes. And I think, for this group, it's especially a safe space to be able to say organic doesn't use synthetic nitrogen. So we know that one in our core. And so really, really glad to hear you guys working on that and acknowledging that. I think it's always carbon all the time, but nitrogen is such an impactful one that we don't talk about enough. We have just a couple more minutes, so I'm going to try to get one more question in, and I'll try to hybridize these two questions. In the Civil Eats article, you mentioned, and I think there's a bit of a talk throughout the article about how the profitability proposition for farms, even with those helpful incentives that Oatly was providing to de-risk it, still make oats not a great, business decision. That is just not the same revenue that farmers can get from other row crops. Any ideas on how, through both diversification of supply chain, which is a soft way of trying to get the second question in while we have time, but also just thinking about the American farm economy. So kind of Canada aside, with the very interesting, very policy-driven farm economics that we have here, how we make oats, try to give oats a more level playing field. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I have a ton of thoughts, and it is obviously like the $60 million question. I mean, there are two, from my perspective, there are two reasons why the economic rentability of oats is such a challenge. One is that the rest of the crops are heavily distorted, right? I mean, I think we have to start there, right? Like corn and soy command the prices that they do because they are incentivized by the government, as obviously, ethanol and biodiesel crops, because there has just been, a tremendous amount invested in those crops by the companies that stand to gain from, the things that they grow. I mean, the things that they sell, the chemicals that they sell, the GMO seeds that they sell. So, one of the things that would have to happen is to remove some of the distortions in the market so that oats can compete on a more level playing field. I don't control that. Nobody on this call controls that, but that is a huge challenge. I think the other thing in a general sense that has to happen is that people need to value oats more, right? Like, why is it, $3 a bushel or whatever the heck it is, when something else is 12? It's because oats have been, disrespected historically over the years. They're kind of seen as a throwaway crop. And so I think, perhaps back to the question we were talking about before, as the market for these things grows, I think, and as I think if we can get to a farming system, and this is our desire, although I don't think it's realistic right this second, if we can get to a place where you can do more of a long-term accounting, right? And you can look at things like, I don't have to put as much nitrogen on, I have a steady buyer, I don't have to send it as far away. I think some of the economics are going to come down. The final thing is that now that oats can qualify for insurance, I think also helps on the balance sheets. You have to have a bit of a track record for that, but now you're able to get insurance in a way you couldn't get before.
I'm ready for
that. Mark, so I was trying to speak really quickly.
That was great. I'm ready for the next Oatly t-shirt to be reading "Respect the Oat." And, right, and trying to think about, I think that's a huge thing, is that trying to figure out how do we at a very fundamental level get folks excited about these crops, because that excitement results in a reasonable premium bump that's going to make this entire thing move.
Maybe we've helped make oats a little bit cool, right? Like if we've done one thing in the world, like maybe we've helped make oats cool.
Yep. And we need more of it. So thank you, Julie. We really appreciate your time today. Thank you for everybody, especially Eric and Michael, for questions and answers and expertise. This has been a great conversation. I hope we get to have another one because I think we have a lot more to unpack. And this has been a really exciting crop that, as Michael so clearly put, a lot of folks can grow. It's a crop, a very democratic crop that we can see a lot across a lot of the country. So that's exciting. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Please keep up with the Oats website, and we will see you next time. Thank you again, Julie.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye, everybody.
Take care.